Whether it be people forced to eat anything they find, people stranded in the ocean for who knows how long, or a rugby team stranded in the mountains, we have all of it on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in at number 10, we have North Korean starvation rumors. None of us really know what's going on in North Korea. We would like to think that we have an idea, but it's all rumors. There are very few people who have been able to escape the struggles of that country, but most of the secrets are well hidden. And while their leader would like to boast like they have a strong economic standing within their walls, there are several stories that say otherwise. One of those stories has been of great famines in impoverished areas. This causes the people to chase down anything for food. Because much of the soil isn't fertile enough to grow crops, some people have had to turn to eating bugs or stray animals to stop from dying from starvation. There are even rumors that when times get really tough, people will go missing, and some people are turning to cannibalism just so they have something to eat. Next on the list, we have LEENDERT HASENBOSCH, a Dutch sailor who was kicked off the boat he was stationed at and left to die. He was exiled for sodomy, and he was left on an island alone in the year 1725. He had a diary which was found later, but his body was never found. It would seem that he might have lasted for a year and a half on the island, but struggled to find food. He most likely had to drink turtle blood and his own urine to stay alive. Some think that he might have made it off the island with a passing ship and never told anyone who he was, since the crew would have left him there if they found out that he performed sodomy. It was different back then. People were a lot more close-minded. Next on the list, we have WITOLD GLINSKI. When you're on the run from the law during World War II, you better never look back, especially when you're Polish and the law is the Soviet Union. He was imprisoned in a gulag, but he was clever enough to come up with a plan with some of the people that were locked away in there. They figured out how to escape and they were successful, but that was just where the story starts. They were now in the middle of a frozen wasteland in Siberia, and if anyone found them, they would be executed. It seemed like the military or the cold would kill them, but they weren't about to quit, so they started walking and they managed to hike all the way through Siberia and make it to the Gobi Desert. They crossed that, and then they made it to the Himalayas, and they crossed those as well to make it into India, which at the time was controlled by the British, so they were now safe. The journey was both dangerous and difficult. They had to suck moss just so they wouldn't die from dehydration. They would catch food here and there, but for most of the venture they had to go days without food. Next on the list, we have the Robertson family. What do you think would be a fun thing to do with your family? How about you all go to the park for a nice day, enjoy nature, maybe hit the beach, you could all go to the movies for an afternoon? That would all be pretty fun if you ask me. Well, what about if you sold everything you owned and then you got a boat and then you and your whole family lived on a boat and sailed around the world? Honestly, if anyone from my family proposed this, I would run away from home and never come back. Could you imagine being stuck on a boat with your relatives for an undetermined amount of time? Well, the Roberts family back in 1971 thought that this was a great idea. A mother, father, and their 3 kids decided that a life at sea was perfect for them, and for the beginning of it, it really worked out. Everything changed when they ran into some killer whales. The whales smashed into their boat and sunk it. They managed to get the whole family into a life raft with some supplies, but their only option was to float and survive. They had 6 days worth of rations, and I'll tell you this wasn't going to be enough because they were stuck on that raft for 54 days. They were able to stay alive by hunting fish and turtles and then drinking their own urine, but by the end of it they were able to get picked up by a fishing boat and they were saved. Next on the list, we have Otokichi. Imagine being 14 and stranded in the ocean. This was the wild story of Otokichi. He was a Japanese teenager working on a boat in the 1800s. It was a transport vessel that would mainly work with rice. Well, one day things didn't go as planned and the ship got blown off course and the sails were destroyed. Now these guys had to find some way to live, so they just started eating the rice. How long do you think you could live off of rice? Well, for Otokichi, it was 4 months. Several of the other crewmates died, but this dude kept living. Eventually, they washed up on the shore of the Washington Olympic Peninsula, and you would think that they would be saying, "Thank God we are saved." Well, that was before they were taken into slavery by a local tribe. Yeah, things just kept getting worse. They were eventually freed when they were passed on to the Hudson Bay Company. Next on the list, we have Debbie KILEY. Debbie went out on a fishing trip with some friends that went pretty sour pretty fast. The boat ended up flipping, and the crew tried to get a life raft together before the people went down, but they only got it half inflated, So the 5 people left had to hold onto this dinghy, and all of them but Debbie and one other man would die. People became so thirsty that they drank seawater, which caused them to hallucinate from dehydration and drift off into the water. Debbie survived and wrote a couple of books about her experience. Next on the list we have the Alexanders. Oh, we have more than one family that watched their boat tip over and fill with water. This time we got the Alexanders. For this story we got to zoom over to the 80s and meet up with a family that wasn't planning on living out at sea but wanted to go for a nice day of sailing. Well, it turns out that the weather wasn't on their side and they ended up flipping their boat. This thing sank faster than the Titanic on fast forward, and now both parents and their 2 kids were floating out in the ocean. The waters were freezing and they only had one option. They had to swim, and eventually they made it to an island. The struggle now was that there wasn't anyone else on the island. The family was now forced to survive without any food, so they went hunting and fishing. Luckily it rained quite a bit while they were on the island, so they had something to drink, but both parents admitted afterwards that they thought they were going to have to watch the other person die, and if it came to that, they thought they might even have to eat them. Next on the list we have Alexander Selkirk. How long do you think you could last if you were stranded? I don't know how long I would go for. I would think that I would be tough enough to keep myself alive for a little while, but I don't know if I could last as long as this guy. This is the story of Alexander Selkirk. He was a Scottish sailor who was kicked off his ship and left on an island. This was back in the 1700s. So the people on board were sure that they just left him to die. Well, it turns out they were wrong. The dude spent 4 years out there and never wavered. Starvation started to get him, but then he became resourceful and was able to find shellfish to live off of. The sea was providing him with a ton of food, but then sea lions came to the shore and pushed him into the jungle. Now, to make sure he didn't starve, he had to chase down wild goats and milk them. At night he would be attacked by rats, but he solved the problem by finding wild cats that would hunt around him if he fed them to keep them close. Eventually he was saved. I wonder if he still ever thought he would be saved after spending 4 years on an island alone. Next on the list we have YOSSI GHINSBERG. Formerly in the Israeli army, YOSSI wanted to do something amazing with his life. He was 21 years old and he wanted to trek into the Amazon rainforest and find places that no one had ever been before. He planned on doing this alone, but while traveling he met 3 other men. 2 of the men were fellow adventurers and the other was a geologist who knew the land and told them where they could find some small villages within the rainforest. They eventually made it to the Amazon rainforest and stopped at a small village to stock up on supplies and then headed on. After a few days of traveling, it was clear that they were lost and eventually the truth came out. The geologist, who apparently knew the land, he was a con man who had tricked them into exploring the jungle with him because he was trying to find a hidden stash of gold to steal from the Amazon people. Well, now none of them knew their way out and the group parted ways. YOSSI and another member of the group jumped on a raft that they made themselves and started to head down a river. The raft broke apart and the 2 men were separated when YOSSI went over a waterfall. For the next 3 weeks, YOSSI wandered around the rainforest being eaten by bugs and doing whatever he could to survive. He would scavenge for dead animals to eat and steal eggs from nests. Eventually he was sure that he was going to die when he couldn't walk from the amount of pain in his limbs. Then he was rescued by the very friend that was separated from him on the raft. This guy came back with a boat to find him. The other 2, no one knows what happened to them. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have the rugby team stuck in the mountains. Back in the year 1972, there was a rugby team that was on a plane that went down in the mountains. They were flying over the Andes and the plane's engines frosted over and then they crashed. Most of the people on board the flight survived, but there were 19 people who died. Unlike a lot of the other stories on this list, when these people were stranded, there was nowhere to get food, and it took rescue teams way longer to get to them. Because of this, some of the people who had survived had to turn to eating some of the people who had died in the crash. Eventually, 72 days later, these people were saved, but they were almost thrown in prison for cannibalism. Can you blame them though? I mean, it's not the first thing I would do, but when you're freezing cold and hungry, you don't really have a lot of options. Alright guys, that has been our list. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I've been your host, Chaderena, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.